30,000 feet above the ground, arrogance feels a lot like invincibility. Matthew Sterling sat in seat 1, sipping champagne and laughing about how he had systematically destroyed his ex-wife's life, confident that his high-priced lawyers had buried every lie he told. He believed Hannah was walking into court tomorrow completely defenseless. But Matthew forgot that in a quiet first-class cabin, sound travels and secrets are hard to keep. He didn't realize that the defenseless woman was sitting 10 rows back, or that the silent, silver-haired man in seat 2A, the one listening to every word of his confession, held the gavel that would decide his fate. Justice was about to be served not in a courtroom, but in the clouds. The air in the exclusive Diamond Sky Lounge at JFK Airport smelled of expensive espresso and old money. It was a scent Matthew Sterling had grown accustomed to, a perfume of privilege that he wore like a second skin. He sat in a high-backed leather armchair, one leg crossed over the other, tapping the screen of his phone with a manicured finger. Across from him, Tiffany Lacroix was busy admiring the way the lounge's recessed lighting caught the facets of her new 3-carat engagement ring. "Matthew, babe," Tiffany purred, extending her hand to catch the light. "Do you think the judge will notice this tomorrow? I don't want it to look like we're too happy. You know, for the sympathy vote." Matthew laughed, a dry barking sound that caused a passing waiter to flinch. "Tiff, it doesn't matter what we look like. The case is done. Hannah has no counsel. She didn't even file a response to the motion for summary judgment. She's walking into that courtroom naked, legally speaking. I'm going to strip her of the house, the alimony, everything. She'll be lucky if she keeps her maiden name." He took a sip of his scotch despite it being 10 o'clock a.m. Matthew Sterling, CEO of Sterling Dynamics, was a man who believed the world rotated because he paid it to. He had spent the last year systematically dismantling the life of the woman who had supported him when he was nothing but a garage inventor. Hannah. "She's pathetic," Tiffany muttered finally, looking up from her ring. "I mean, she didn't even fight for the custody modification. Does she even care about the kids?" "She can't afford to care," Matthew sneered. "I drained the joint accounts 3 months ago. Legally gray area, strategically genius. By the time she finds a lawyer who will work pro bono, the gavel will have already banged. We're flying to LA just to sign the papers and watch her cry." The automatic glass doors of the lounge slid open with a soft whoosh. Matthew didn't look up initially, but the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere caught his attention. The lounge, usually a hum of quiet business deals, went silent for a beat. Matthew turned his head. Standing at the entrance, clutching a battered carry-on bag and wearing a coat that had seen better days, was Hannah Jenkins. She looked tired, the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. Her blonde hair, once vibrant, was pulled back in a severe practical bun. Her eyes were shadowed, but her chin was high. She held a boarding pass in her hand, looking out of place amidst the designer suits and silk scarves. "No way!" Tiffany gasped, a cruel smile spreading across her face. "Is she stalking us?" Matthew stood up, buttoning his jacket. He enjoyed this. He enjoyed the power dynamic. He walked over to where Hannah was presenting her pass to the confused concierge. "Hannah!" Matthew boomed, his voice carrying across the lounge. "I didn't know they let economy passengers wander in here, looking for scraps." Hannah stiffened. She turned slowly, her face an unreadable mask of calm. "Hello, Matthew. I have access through my credit card points. I just wanted a coffee before the flight." "Points?" Matthew laughed, turning to glance at Tiffany, who was snickering behind him. "You're using points to survive Jesus, Hannah. This is embarrassing. Just sign the settlement. Why drag this out? You're flying to LA for the hearing, aren't you? You're going to stand in front of Judge Hawthorne all by yourself and mumble about how unfair it is. I'm going to tell the truth, Hannah said softly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had a steel core that Matthew hadn't heard in years. The truth. Matthew stepped closer, invading her personal space. He lowered his voice to a menacing hiss. The truth is what I pay for, Hannah. I have the best lawyers in New York. You have, what, a library card and a sob story. No one is going to defend you. You're a liability. Your history. A few people in the lounge were staring now. A businessman in the corner lowered his Wall Street Journal. A woman near the window paused her typing. But nobody moved. It was the bystander effect of the wealthy. They watched the carnage, but never touched the blood. I don't need a high-priced lawyer to prove I was a good mother, Matthew, Hannah said, gripping the handle of her bag tighter. And I don't need your money. I just want what's fair. Fair is a fairy tale for poor people. Tiffany chimed in, walking up to link her arm through Matthew's. She looked Hannah up and down with exaggerated pity. Nice coat, sweetie. Is that vintage or just goodwill? Hannah looked at Tiffany, the woman who had been her friend before she was Matthew's mistress. It was the coat I wore to my father's funeral, Tiffany. It keeps me warm. Tiffany rolled her eyes. Depressing. Come on, Matthew. The smell of desperation is ruining my appetite. Matthew smirked. See you in court, Hannah. Or actually, I won't. I'll be the one sitting at the winner's table while you're being escorted out by bailiffs. He turned his back on her, guiding Tiffany back to their plush seats. Hannah stood there for a moment, isolated in the center of the room. She took a deep breath, adjusted her bag, and walked to a small, empty table in the far corner, as far away from them as possible. She pulled out a thick, chaotic stack of papers from her bag. It wasn't a sleek, legal brief. It was a mess of receipts, printed emails, and handwritten notes. She put on a pair of drugstore reading glasses and began to highlight something, her hand trembling slightly. In the shadows of the lounge near the window, an older man with silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard watched the entire exchange. He was dressed in a modest tweed suit, sipping tea. He hadn't looked at his phone once. His eyes shifted from the arrogant couple laughing over champagne to the lone woman highlighting receipts in the corner. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. It was thin, unlike Hannah's stack. He opened it, glanced at the first page, and then looked back at Matthew. The man didn't smile. He just closed the folder, finished his tea, and checked his watch. The flight to Los Angeles was boarding in 30 minutes. The walk down the jet bridge felt like a march to the gallows for Hannah. Every step was heavy. She had spent her last few $100s on this flight. The hearing in Los Angeles was tomorrow morning. It was a status conference and final decree hearing. Matthew's lawyers had petitioned to move the venue to LA, claiming Matthew's business was now headquartered there. It was a lie he still lived in New York, but his lawyers had dazzled the clerk with paperwork, and Hannah didn't know how to object in time. Now she had to fly across the country or lose her children by default. She boarded the plane, clutching her ticket for seat 34B. Middle seat. Economy. As she passed through the first-class cabin, the atmosphere shifted from the sterile airport air to something warmer, scented with hot towels and champagne. And there they were. Matthew and Tiffany were seated in 1A and 1B, the prime spots. They were already drinking mimosas before takeoff. "Oh, look," Matthew said loudly, as Hannah tried to shuffle past quickly, her bag bumping against the narrow aisle. "The economy procession has begun." Tiffany giggled, clinking her glass against his. Do you think they serve peanuts back there, or just disappointment? Hannah kept her head down, muttering a quiet, "Excuse me," to the flight attendant. "Wait, wait," Matthew called out, reaching out to block the aisle with his arm. He wasn't done playing with his food. "Hannah, seriously, I have a proposition. You withdraw your contest to the alimony today, right now. Send an email to the court clerk and I don't know. Maybe I'll pay for your return ticket. Coach, obviously. Please let me pass, Matthew," Hannah whispered, her face burning. The line of passengers behind her was growing. People were beginning to grumble, craning their necks to see the holdup. "I'm trying to help you," Matthew said, feigning innocence. "You're going to lose Hannah. Judge Hawthorne is a hard-liner. He hates time wasters, and walking into his courtroom with that," he pointed to her messy bag, "that's wasting his time." "Sir, please lower your arm," a flight attendant said firmly, stepping in. "We need to finish boarding." Matthew rolled his eyes and retracted his arm. "Just trying to save the court system some tax dollars," he muttered. Hannah rushed past, tears pricking her eyes. She made her way to the back of the plane, squeezing into the cramped middle seat between a teenager with oversized headphones and a sleeping man who smelled of onions. Back in first class, the cabin settled. The older gentleman from the lounge, the one in the tweed suit, boarded last. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace. He handed his boarding pass to the attendant. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Wright," the attendant said, checking the manifest. "Seat 2A, right behind Mr. Sterling." The man nodded, offering a polite, tight smile. "Thank you." He placed his briefcase in the overhead bin, but kept the manila folder out, sliding it into the seat pocket in front of him. He sat down in 2A. Directly in front of him, in 1A. Matthew was reclining his seat all the way back, encroaching on the man's space, before the plane had even left the gate. "Matthew, look at this," Tiffany said, her voice carrying easily over the seats. She was scrolling through her phone. The lawyer sent the final draft of the incompetence motion. It details how Hannah failed to maintain the house. It mentions the garden weeds. Matthew laughed. "The garden weeds, God, my lawyers are sharks. I love it. If we can prove she can't even manage a garden, how can she manage an estate? And the medical records?" Tiffany asked, lowering her voice slightly, but not enough. "Did they include the thing about her therapy?" The man in 2A froze. His hand hovered over the volume knob of his noise-cancelling headphones. He didn't turn them on. He leaned forward slightly. "Oh, the anxiety stuff," Matthew scoffed. "Yeah, we framed it as emotional instability. We have a doctor on payroll who signed an affidavit saying she's unfit to make financial decisions. She went to therapy for grief after her dad died, and we're spinning it as a mental breakdown. It's brilliant." "Is it legal?" Tiffany asked, sounding more excited than concerned. "It's legal if the other side doesn't object," Matthew said arrogantly. "And who is going to object Hannah? She doesn't even know what an affidavit is. By the time she reads it, the gavel will have dropped. The judge will see unstable and unemployed, and hand everything to me." The man in 2A slowly pulled the manila folder from the seat pocket. He opened it on his tray table. Inside wasn't a magazine or a newspaper. It was a copy of the court docket for Sterling versus Sterling, and clipped to the front was a handwritten note on official judicial letterhead. The plane began its taxi. Matthew continued to loudly dismantle his ex-wife's character, detailing every trap he had laid in the legal paperwork, every lie he had fabricated to ensure he kept his millions, while she was left with nothing. He spoke with the confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. He didn't notice the man behind him taking notes, As the plane climbed to cruising altitude, the fasten seat belt sign turned off. Matthew stood up to retrieve something from the overhead bin. He looked down at the man in 2A. "Hey, buddy," Matthew said, snapping his fingers. "You mind closing your window shade? The glare is hitting my screen." The man in 2A looked up. His eyes were steel gray, piercing and intelligent. He didn't reach for the shade. "I prefer the light," the man said. His voice was deep, resonant. Matthew blinked, taken aback by the refusal. "Excuse me, I paid $8,000 for this seat. I want to watch my movie." "And I paid for this seat," the man replied calmly. "And I am reading." "Reading what?" Matthew sneered, glancing down at the man's tray table. "The crossword." The man tapped the manila folder. "A case file. A very interesting one. It's about a man who thinks he can purchase justice." Matthew frowned. The description felt too close to home, but his ego dismissed it. "Sounds boring. Close the shade or I'll call the attendant." "Go ahead," the man said, turning a page. "But I wouldn't cause a scene if I were you, Mr. Sterling. You have a big day tomorrow." Matthew froze. The blood drained from his face. He hadn't introduced himself to this man. "How do you know my name?" Matthew demanded, stepping closer. Tiffany turned around, sensing the tension. The man in 2A finally smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a wolf watching a sheep wander away from the herd. "I know a lot of things, Matthew," the man said softly. "I know about the offshore accounts in the Caymans you didn't disclose in the discovery phase. I know about the consulting fees you pay to Miss Lacroix here to hide income. And I know about the grief counseling records you illegally obtained to smear the mother of your children." The cabin went deadly silent. "Who are you?" Matthew whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and sudden primal fear. "Are you a private investigator? Did she hire you?" The man closed the folder. "She didn't hire anyone. You made sure of that. You banked on her being defenseless. You banked on the system being blind." The man stood up. He wasn't particularly tall, but he projected an authority that made Matthew shrink back. "My name," the man said loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear, "is Leonard Hawthorne, but you probably know me better as the hardliner. I'm the judge assigned to your case in Los Angeles." Matthew's knees buckled. He grabbed the headrest of his seat to steady himself. Tiffany gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Judge Hawthorne," Matthew stammered. "But you... Why are you on this flight? You're supposed to be in LA." "I was visiting my grandchildren in New York," Judge Hawthorne said, his voice cold. "I decided to fly back a day early to review the case files. Imagine my surprise when the plaintiff and the defendant ended up on the same flight as me. And imagine my further surprise when the plaintiff spent the first hour of the flight confessing to perjury and fraud within earshot of the bench." Matthew opened his mouth, but no words came out. "Sit down, Mr. Sterling," the judge ordered. It wasn't a request, it was a command from the bench. "We have a long flight ahead of us, and since you seem so eager to discuss the case, I think it's time we brought the defendant up here to join the conversation." "Stewardess." The flight attendant, who had been watching wide-eyed, stepped forward. "Yes, sir." "Please go to seat 34B, the judge said, handing her his platinum card. "Upgrade Ms. Hannah Jenkins to first class. Put her in seat 2B right next to me. I believe she requires legal counsel." The walk from row 34 to row 1 is a distance of perhaps 50 feet, but for Hannah Jenkins it felt like crossing a ravine. Back in seat 34, the air was stagnant, heavy with the scent of too many bodies in too little space. Hannah had been trying to make herself small, her elbows tucked into her ribs, her eyes fixed on the seat-back pocket in front of her, where a piece of gum was stuck to the safety manual. She was mentally rehearsing her speech for the judge. A speech she knew in her heart would sound frantic and desperate compared to the polished lies Matthew's lawyers would present. When the flight attendant, a woman named Emily with kind eyes and a pristine uniform, tapped her on the shoulder, Hannah flinched. "Miss Jenkins?" Emily asked softly. Hannah's stomach dropped. "Yes. Is there a problem with my ticket? I can check my bag if it's too big, I promise." Her mind instantly went to the worst-case scenario Matthew had found a way to kick her off the plane. "No, ma'am." Emily smiled, though the smile was tight, betraying the tension she had just witnessed in the front cabin. "There's been a seat change. A gentleman in first class has requested your company. He's covered the upgrade." The man next to Hannah, the one smelling of onions, grunted in his sleep. The teenager with the headphones looked up, blinking. "Matthew?" Hannah whispered, confusion clouding her fear. "Why would he—" "I don't believe it was Mr. Sterling, ma'am," Emily said, her voice lowering. "It was the gentleman in 2A Judge Hawthorne. He insists." Judge Hawthorne. The name hit Hannah like a physical blow. She froze. The blood roared in her ears, drowning out the drone of the engines. That was the name on the papers. The terrifying, faceless authority figure who held her children's fate in his hands. Why was he here? And why did he want her? I don't understand," Hannah stammered. "He said it's a matter of court record," Emily said gently, reaching for Hannah's battered carry-on. "Come with me, Miss Jenkins. You really don't want to keep him waiting." Hannah stood up, her legs trembling. She navigated out of the cramped row, her cardigan catching on the armrest. She smoothed her skirt, a modest grey thing she had bought at a thrift store specifically for court, and began the walk. As she passed through the curtain, separating economy from business, and then business from first, the noise level dropped. The air grew cooler, crisper. The lighting shifted from harsh fluorescent to a warm amber glow. She stepped into the first-class cabin. The scene that greeted her was frozen in time. Matthew was slumped in seat 1, his skin the color of wet putty. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. Tiffany in seat 1B was furiously typing on her phone, her knuckles white, refusing to look up. And there in seat 2, sat the silver-haired man from the lounge. He wasn't looking at Matthew. He was looking at her. He stood up as she approached, a gesture of respect that Matthew hadn't shown her in 10 years. "Ms. Jenkins," the judge said. His voice was deep and gravelly, like stones rolling in a riverbed. "I apologize for the interruption of your flight. I believe we have some matters to discuss." He gestured to the empty plush leather seat next to him, seat 2B, directly behind Tiffany. Hannah gripped the strap of her bag until her fingers hurt. She looked at Matthew. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He was staring out the window, his jaw clenched so hard, a muscle feathered in his cheek. "Judge Hawthorne," Hannah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Am I in trouble?" "Not you, my dear," Hawthorne said, his eyes softening as he took in her frayed coat and the exhaustion etched into her face. "Please sit. Emily, perhaps a glass of water for Miss Jenkins. And a warm towel." Hannah sat. The seat was enormous, swallowing her small frame. It smelled of leather and expensive sanitizer. She placed her bag at her feet, feeling acutely aware of how out of place it looked against the pristine carpet. "I don't understand," she said again, looking at the judge. Matthew said, "I heard what Mr. Sterling said." Hawthorne interrupted, his voice hardening, as he glanced at the back of Matthew's head. "I heard a great deal. In a courtroom, Mrs. Jenkins." The truth is often obscured by procedure and paperwork. Lawyers are paid to paint pictures, but up here, he gestured around the small cabin, there is nowhere to hide the truth. We are in a unique position. The plaintiff, the defendant, and the trier of fact are all contained in a metal tube at 35,000 feet. Matthew turned around slowly. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a slimy, desperate charm. "Your Honor," he began, his voice cracking slightly. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I was just venting. You know how stressful divorces are. I didn't mean any of that, literally." Hawthorne didn't even blink. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a fountain pen. He uncapped it slowly. The scratching sound loud in the silent cabin. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, his tone conversational but deadly. "Are you familiar with the term ex parte communication? Yes, of course," Matthew stammered. "It generally forbids a judge from speaking to one party without the other present," Hawthorne explained. "It ensures fairness. But you see, since you decided to loudly discuss the details of your fraudulent financial disclosures and your strategy to manufacture medical evidence within 3 feet of my ear while your wife was stuck in the back of the plane, I felt it was only fair to level the playing field. Now that Ms. Jenkins is present, this is no longer ex parte. Now it is simply a pre-trial conference." Matthew swallowed hard. "Sir, I really think I should call my lawyer." "You are welcome to try." Hawthorne gestured to the phone. "But we are over the Midwest, and I control the schedule in my courtroom. Right now, my courtroom is row 2. The judge turned his back on Matthew and looked at Hannah. He opened the manila folder on his tray table. "Ms. Jenkins," he said, putting on a pair of reading glasses. "I have reviewed the file submitted by your husband's counsel. It is extensive. It paints a picture of a woman who is erratic, financially irresponsible, and an absentee mother." Hannah lowered her head, tears hot in her eyes. "It's not true," she whispered. "I was the one who drove them to school every day. I was the one who managed the books for his company when we started in the garage. He fired me when the company went public. He cut off my access to the accounts." "I know," Hawthorne said. Hannah looked up, surprised. "You do." "I do now," Hawthorne said, tapping the folder. "Because 10 minutes ago, Mr. Sterling bragged to his fiancée about draining the joint accounts to leave you defenseless. He called it a strategic genius move." Hannah gasped. A sob escaped her throat, a mixture of validation and horror. She looked at the back of Matthew's seat. You admitted it?" Matthew didn't answer. He was shrinking into his seat, wishing the plane would simply vanish. "He did more than admit it," Hawthorne continued, flipping a page. "He also discussed the garden weeds, a trivial matter in the motion aimed to show your negligence." "Tell me, Hannah, why did the garden have weeds?" Hannah wiped her eyes. "Because I had to fire the landscaper 3 months ago to pay for groceries." Matthew stopped the alimony payments early. He said it was a banking error, but the bank said the stop payment came from him. I was out there pulling weeds myself on weekends, but I got sick last month. I had the flu. I couldn't keep up. Hawthorne nodded slowly, writing a note in the margins of the docket. "Financial duress caused by the plaintiff used as evidence of defendant's incompetence," he murmured as he wrote. "And the therapy?" Hawthorne asked, his voice gentler now. "The motion claims you are being treated for severe emotional instability and paranoid delusions. My father died, Hannah said, her voice steadying. Last year. It was sudden, a heart attack. I was devastated. I went to a grief counselor for 6 weeks to help me cope so I wouldn't burden the children with my sadness. That's all it was. We talked about my dad, about missing him. We framed it as a breakdown. Matthew's voice from earlier echoed in the judge's memory. Hawthorne looked at Matthew. Mr. Sterling, turn around. Matthew hesitated, then slowly turned. His face was pale sweat beading on his forehead. Your motion includes an affidavit from a Dr. Aris, Hawthorne said, holding up a piece of paper, stating that Mrs. Jenkins is unfit. Did Dr. Aris ever examine Mrs. Jenkins? Matthew licked his lips. I believe he reviewed her files. He's an expert witness. He's a hired gun, Hawthorne corrected sharply. And you admitted to Ms. Lacroix that you have him on payroll. That is subornation of perjury, Mr. Sterling. In my state, that is a felony. In my courtroom, it is a death sentence for your credibility. Tiffany, who had been silent, suddenly unbuckled her seatbelt. She stood up. I need to use the restroom, she announced, her voice shrill. She grabbed her purse. She looked at Matthew with a mixture of disgust and self-preservation. I didn't sign anything, Matthew. This is your mess. She pushed past the flight attendant and locked herself in the lavatory. Matthew was alone. The cabin was silent, save for the hum of the ventilation. Judge Hawthorne did not let the silence offer Matthew any comfort. He let it stretch heavy and suffocating before he turned his attention back to the file. Let's dig a little deeper, shall we? Hawthorne said, his finger tracing a line on a spreadsheet. He wasn't shouting. The drama wasn't in the volume of his voice. It was in the methodical, surgical way he was dissecting Matthew's life. It was a slow-motion car crash, and Matthew was in the driver's seat without a seatbelt. Hannah, the judge said, using her first name, now signaling a shift. He was no longer just a judge. He was an investigator. This file contains a list of assets Mr. Sterling claims are marital property. It lists the house in Connecticut, the 2 cars, and a savings account with $40,000. Does that sound accurate to you? Hannah frowned, leaning in to look at the paper Hawthorne held out to her. The house and cars, yes. But $40,000, Matthew told me the business was struggling. He said we had almost no liquid cash. That's why he said I had to sign the post-ENUP last year, retroactively. He said we were on the brink of bankruptcy. Bankruptcy, Hawthorne repeated, tasting the word like sour milk. Mr. Sterling is Sterling Dynamics, facing bankruptcy. Matthew stayed silent, staring at his knees. I can answer that, Hawthorne said, because before you realized who I was, you were boasting about your offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Specifically, you mentioned hiding income to lower your tax bracket and your alimony obligations. Hawthorne turned a page. And you mentioned consulting fees paid to Ms. Lacroix. The bathroom door clicked open. Tiffany emerged looking flushed. She had clearly been crying or perhaps furiously deleting emails. She sat back down, keeping as much distance from Matthew as the seat allowed. Ms. Lacroix, Hawthorne said without looking up, since you are now a party to this conversation, I must ask, what consulting services do you provide for Sterling Dynamics? Tiffany jumped. I'm a brand ambassador. A brand ambassador? Hawthorne nodded. And does a brand ambassador typically receive $20,000 a month for a company that manufactures industrial ball bearings? Hannah gasped. $20,000 a month? I begged him for $500 last week to buy the kids' winter coats. He said he didn't have it. The cruelty of it hung in the air. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the sadism. Matthew hadn't just wanted to leave Hannah. He had wanted to crush her. He wanted to punish her for being the witness to his humble beginnings. "This is material fraud," Hawthorne said, closing the folder with a definitive thud. "Mr. Sterling, you have submitted sworn financial statements to my court that are, by your own admission, works of fiction." Matthew finally found his voice. It was thin and reedy. "Judge, please, can we discuss a settlement? I don't want to waste the court's time." "Oh, you're not wasting my time anymore," Hawthorne said, a cold smile touching his lips. "Now I'm quite fascinated. You see, I was going to retire next year. I was tired of the lies. But this is reinvigorating." The judge turned to Hannah. "Ms. Jenkins, your husband is proposing a settlement. Since you have no counsel present, I cannot advise you on what to accept. However, I can tell you what the penalty for perjury and fraud is. It usually involves the forfeiture of hidden assets and incarceration." Matthew flinched at the word incarceration. "I'll give her the house," Matthew blurted out. "She can have the house, and full alimony. The original amount." Hannah looked at him, shocking herself with the lack of gratitude she felt. She felt only anger. "The house is mortgaged to the hilt, Matthew. You took out a second loan against it without telling me. The bank sent a notice last week." Matthew looked shocked. "You saw that." "I check the mail, Matthew," she said quietly. "I'm not the invalid you paint me to be." "He tried to saddle you with the debt," Hawthorne surmised. "Give her the asset that is actually a liability while he keeps the cash offshore." The judge leaned back, clasping his hands over his stomach. He looked like a grandfather deciding which story to tell, but his eyes were locked on Matthew like a sniper. "Here is what is going to happen," Hawthorne said. The cabin was so quiet that the ice melting in Tiffany's abandoned glass tinkled softly. "We have 3 hours left in this flight. In that time, Mr. Sterling, you are going to request a pen and paper from the flight attendant. You are going to write a new declaration. You are going to list every single account number, every shell company, and every consulting fee you have authorized in the last 5 years. You are going to do this because if I find even 1 penny missing when I subpoena the banks on Monday morning, and I will subpoena them, I will hold you in contempt of court, so severe you won't see the outside of a cell until your children are in college." Matthew looked at Tiffany. "Help me. You know the account numbers." Tiffany looked at the judge, then at Hannah, then back at Matthew. The calculus of survival was happening behind her eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about, Matthew," Tiffany said coldly. "I just spent the money you gave me. I didn't ask where it came from. I'm a victim here too." You snake," Matthew hissed. "It was your idea to hide the assets in your name." "And there we have it," Hawthorne interrupted, looking at Hannah. "Conspiracy to commit fraud. The plot thickens." He turned to Hannah. "Hannah, pull out your stack of papers, the ones you were highlighting in the lounge." Hannah reached down and lifted her messy, dog-eared pile of documents. She placed them on the tray table next to the judge's sleek file. "I know they're a mess," she apologized. "They are beautiful," Hawthorne said gently, "because they are the truth. Now let's go through them. I want you to show me exactly what it costs to raise your children. I want to see every receipt you saved while he was claiming bankruptcy. We are going to build the real file right here, right now." For the next 3 hours, the dynamic in the cabin shifted entirely. Matthew sat in seat 1, hunched over a notepad, sweating through his designer shirt, his hand cramping as he wrote down account numbers, terrified that missing one would end his life. Tiffany sat in 1B, staring out the window, pretending she didn't exist, occasionally sipping vodka with a shaking hand. But in row 2, a different scene played out. Hannah Jenkins, for the first time in years, was being heard. She showed the judge the emails Matthew had sent, the threats, the receipts for the children's braces he refused to pay for. Hawthorne listened. He asked questions. He nodded. He didn't act as her lawyer. He acted as a witness to her reality. He was validating her sanity. As the pilot announced their initial descent into Los Angeles, Hawthorne closed Hannah's messy file and placed his hand on top of it. "You have done a good job, Hannah," he said softly. "You defended your children when you had nothing to defend them with. That is the definition of a good mother." Hannah wiped a tear from her cheek. "Thank you, Your Honor. I was so scared of today." "You don't need to be scared anymore," Hawthorne said, glancing at the defeated man in front of them. "The file is complete." The plane dipped the landing gear, groaning as it lowered. The physical journey was ending, but the legal nightmare for Matthew Sterling was just beginning. The wheels of the aircraft kissed the tarmac at LAX with a violent shudder, a physical jolt that seemed to snap the tension in the first-class cabin like a dry twig. For Hannah, the landing felt like an arrival in a new world. For Matthew, it felt like the cell door slamming shut. The fasten seatbelt sign pinged off. Usually this was Matthew's cue to leap up, grab his bag, and rush to the door to be the first one off, asserting his dominance over the slower-moving masses. Today he didn't move. He sat frozen in seat 1. Staring at the seat back pocket, where he had shoved the notepad. The notepad that now contained a handwritten confession of tax evasion, wire fraud, and perjury. Judge Hawthorne stood up slowly, methodically, gathering his things. He reached over to Matthew's seat. "I'll take that," Hawthorne said, his voice low, but brook no argument firm. Matthew's hand trembled as he retrieved the notepad. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his knuckles white. "Don't even think about shredding it," Hawthorne warned, his eyes narrowing. "I have already photographed every page with my phone. That physical copy is merely a formality for the court clerk. Hand it over." Matthew surrendered the pad. It was the surrender of his life. "Miss Jenkins," the judge said, turning to Hannah, "do you have a ride from the airport?" Hannah stood up, hugging her battered coat around her. I was going to take the shuttle bus to the motel near the courthouse," Hawthorne said. "My town car is waiting. I will drop you at your hotel. It is on my way." "I object," Matthew blurted out, his instincts flaring up one last time. That's preferential treatment. You can't share a car with the defendant." Hawthorne paused in the aisle, looking down at Matthew with a look of profound disappointment. "Mr. Sterling, you spent the last 5 hours receiving preferential treatment by confessing your crimes to a judge instead of an FBI agent. I suggest you find your own way to the courthouse tomorrow. And bring a toothbrush. You might not be going home." The exit from the plane was a blur. The flight attendants, who had sensed the shift in power, nodded respectfully to Hannah as she passed. "Good luck, ma'am," Emily whispered, slipping a small chocolate bar into Hannah's hand. They walked up the jet bridge. The air in the terminal was stifling, thick with the noise of travelers and the smell of pretzels. Hannah walked beside the judge, her head held high for the first time in months. Behind them, trailing by 20 feet, Matthew and Tiffany walked in silence. When they reached the curbside pickup, the California sun was blinding. A sleek black sedan pulled up. The driver stepped out to open the door for the judge. Hawthorne gestured for Hannah to get in. Before he followed, he turned to watch Matthew and Tiffany emerge from the sliding glass doors. Matthew looked around for his usual limo service, but he had forgotten to call them in his panic. He looked at Tiffany. "Tiff, call an Uber," he snapped, wiping sweat from his forehead. "We need to get to the hotel. We need to call Blackwood. We need to figure out how to spin this." Tiffany Lacroix stood there, her designer luggage sitting on the concrete. She looked at Matthew. Really looked at him for the first time. She saw the fear, the weakness, and the impending ruin. She saw a man who was about to lose his fortune, his reputation, and his freedom. She looked at her engagement ring. Then she looked at the Uber app open on her phone. "No," Tiffany said. Matthew blinked. "What?" "I said no." Tiffany repeated, her voice steady. She gripped the handle of her suitcase. "I'm not going to the hotel with you, and I'm not calling you a car." "Are you insane?" Matthew hissed, grabbing her arm. "We're in this together. The judge heard you too." Tiffany yanked her arm away. "The judge heard you say you hid the money in my name. He heard you say you set it up. I was just the girlfriend, Matthew. I was duped. That's my story. I'm going to the district attorney's office in the morning, and I'm going to offer them my cooperation in exchange for immunity before you can throw me under the bus." Matthew's jaw dropped. You wouldn't." "Watch me," she said. A taxi pulled up. Tiffany hailed it. The driver popped the trunk, and she heaved her own bag inside. "Tiffany!" Matthew screamed as she got in. "You're nothing without me." "Nothing." She rolled down the window as the taxi began to pull away. She lowered her sunglasses, her eyes cold. "Maybe. But at least I'm not going to jail." The taxi sped off, merging into the chaotic LAX traffic. Matthew Sterling stood alone on the curb, surrounded by strangers, the exhaust fumes choking him. He had no wife, no fiancée, no leverage, and no plan. For the first time in his life, he was exactly what he had called Hannah, pathetic. The Los Angeles Superior Court is a building designed to intimidate. It is a fortress of stone and glass where echoes bounce off the marble floors and hope often goes to die. At 8:55 a.m. courtroom 402 was buzzing. Matthew Sterling sat at the plaintiff's table. He looked haggard. He hadn't slept. His suit, usually pressed to perfection, looked slightly crumpled. Next to him sat his attorney, Marcus Blackwood. Blackwood was a shark in a three-piece suit. He was the most expensive divorce attorney in New York, flown in, specifically for the kill. He was arranging his papers, confident, smiling at the court clerk. He had no idea what had happened on Flight 404. Matthew hadn't been able to reach him last night. Blackwood had been at a gala, and didn't take calls after 8 p.m. "Relax, Matthew," Blackwood whispered, patting Matthew's shoulder. "I saw the docket. She didn't file a response. This is a slaughter. We'll be out of here by lunch. I have a tea time at Riviera at 2. "Marcus," Matthew hissed, his voice trembling. "We need to talk. Something happened on the plane. Later." Blackwood dismissed him, checking his Rolex. "The judge is coming in. Just let me do the talking. Look sad when I mention the weeds. Look concerned when I mention the therapy. But the judge is—" "All rise," the bailiff bellowed, cutting Matthew off. The heavy oak doors behind the bench swung open. Hannah stood at the defendant's table. She was alone. No lawyer sat beside her. She wore the same grey skirt and cardigan, but her hair was neat and her spine was straight. She wasn't looking at Matthew. She was looking at the bench. Judge Leonard Hawthorne ascended the steps and took his seat. He adjusted his robes, the black fabric billowing around him. He didn't look like the man in the tweed suit anymore. He looked like judgment personified. He placed a thick manila folder on the bench. Then he placed a small spiral-bound notepad on top of it. Matthew stopped breathing. Case number 49,204. Sterling versus Sterling, the clerk announced. Status conference and final decree. Good morning, Your Honor, Marcus Blackwood boomed, standing up and buttoning his jacket. He projected his voice for the back row. Marcus Blackwood for the plaintiff, Mr. Sterling. We are ready to proceed. Since the defendant has no counsel and has failed to file a timely response, we move for a default judgment in favor of my client on all counts. Hawthorne peered over his reading glasses. He let Blackwood stand there for a moment, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Mr. Blackwood, Hawthorne said softly, you are moving for default based on the assertion that the marital assets are minimal and that the defendant is mentally unfit to manage them. Is that correct? It is, Your Honor, Blackwood said smoothly. We have affidavits regarding Ms. Jenkins' erratic behavior, and the financial disclosures show that the estate is essentially insolvent due to market downturns. Insolvent, Hawthorne repeated. Interesting word. The judge picked up the spiral notepad. Mr. Blackwood, when was the last time you spoke to your client? Blackwood frowned, sensing a trap but unable to see it. Briefly this morning, Your Honor, but I am fully briefed on the file. Are you? Hawthorne asked. Because I have here a document, handwritten by your client, approximately 14 hours ago, at an altitude of 35,000 feet. Blackwood turned to look at Matthew. Matthew had his head in his hands. Mr. Sterling, the judge addressed Matthew directly, would you like to explain to your counsel what Exhibit A is, or shall I read it into the record? Matthew didn't speak. He couldn't. Very well, Hawthorne said. He opened the notepad. Item 1. A shell corporation named Blue Horizon Consulting, registered in the Cayman Islands, currently holding $4.2 million. Item 2. A safety deposit box in Zurich containing loose diamonds, valued at $300,000. The courtroom gasped. A reporter in the back row began typing furiously. Blackwood's face went from confident tan to chalk white. He looked at Matthew. Matthew, what is this item 3? Hawthorne continued, his voice rising slightly, cutting through the murmurs. A line item for medical fabrication. A payment of $15,000 to a Dr. Aris to sign an affidavit without performing an examination. Hawthorne slammed the notepad down. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Mr. Blackwood, Hawthorne said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. You are standing before me asking for a default judgment based on evidence your client has admitted in writing to me is forged. You are asking me to leave a mother and 2 children destitute while your client hides millions offshore. Your Honor, I had no idea, Blackwood stammered, backing away from the table as if Matthew were radioactive. I withdraw the motion. I need to consult with my client. There will be no consultation, Hawthorne thundered. This is not a negotiation anymore. This is a crime scene. The judge turned his gaze to Hannah. Jenkins, he said gently, you came here today expecting to lose everything. You came here believing that the system was built to crush you, and frankly, if not for a coincidence of flight scheduling, it might have. He picked up a gavel. I'm vacating the previous orders regarding the temporary support. Effective immediately, all assets listed in this flight manifesto are frozen. I am ordering a forensic audit of Sterling Dynamics to be paid for by the plaintiff. Your Honor, please, Matthew cried out, standing up. I'll lose the company. The investors will pull out. You should have thought of that before you bought a first-class ticket to your own funeral, Hawthorne snapped. Furthermore, the judge continued, I am issuing a bench warrant for the arrest of Dr. Arris for perjury and fraud, and regarding custody. Hawthorne looked at Hannah. Mr. Jenkins, based on the evidence of your stability and the plaintiff's admitted attempt to gaslight this court, I am granting you full legal and physical custody of the minor children. Mr. Sterling will have supervised visitation only pending a psychological evaluation to determine his fitness to parent. Matthew slumped back into his chair, sliding down until he was almost under the table. And finally, Hawthorne said, looking at Blackwood, Counselor, you are dangerously close to being sanctioned. If you want to save your license, I suggest you sit down and stay quiet while I calculate the alimony arrears. And I warn you, I'm going to use the real numbers this time. Hawthorne picked up a calculator. He punched in numbers for a solid minute, the clicking sound the only noise in the room. Mr. Sterling, Hawthorne said finally, you complained on the plane about the cost of maintaining the garden. You said you loved the idea that your wife was pulling weeds. Hawthorne smiled a grim final expression. You are going to pay Ms. Jenkins a lump sum of $5 million from the Cayman account. And you are going to transfer the deed of the Connecticut house to her mortgage-free. You will pay off the lien immediately. I can't, Matthew whispered. That's everything. Then you better start pulling weeds, Mr. Sterling, Hawthorne said, because you're going to need a new job. Bang! The gavel came down. Court is adjourned. The silence that followed the banging of the gavel was heavier than the noise of the trial. It was the silence of a vacuum where Matthew Sterling's ego used to be. Two bailiffs moved toward the plaintiff's table. They weren't there to escort him to his car. They were there to ensure he didn't leave the building before the district attorney's team arrived to discuss the admitted wire fraud. Matthew sat frozen, staring at the wood grain of the table, his hands trembling uncontrollably. He looked up, searching for someone. Anyone to save him. He looked for Tiffany, but her seat was empty. He looked for his lawyer, but Marcus Blackwood was already packing his briefcase, distancing himself from the radioactive fallout of his client's crimes. Finally, Matthew looked at Hannah. He expected to see triumph. He expected her to sneer, to laugh, to give him the same look of disdain he had given her for years. But Hannah just looked peaceful. She looked at him with a distant kind of pity, like one looks at a roadkill animal. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She simply gathered her messy stack of papers, the papers that had saved her life, and turned her back on him. Ms. Jenkins, Judge Hawthorne called out softly as he stepped down from the bench, removing his robe to reveal the simple suit underneath. Hannah paused at the gate. Yes, Your Honor. Hawthorne walked over to her. The courtroom staff watched in awe. Judges rarely descended to the floor like this. He extended a hand. I trust your flight home will be more comfortable, he said, a twinkle in his steel-grey eyes. I believe the airline has a policy about refunding tickets when the passenger experiences turbulence. Hannah took his hand, her eyes welling up. I don't know how to thank you. You didn't just save my home. You gave me back my voice. I didn't give you anything, Hannah, Hawthorne said firmly. You had the truth in that bag the whole time. I just made sure someone finally listened to it. Go home to your children. Buy them those winter coats. Hannah nodded, wiping her tears. She walked down the center aisle, her heels clicking rhythmically on the floor. It was the sound of freedom. She pushed open the heavy double doors and stepped out onto the courthouse steps. The Los Angeles smog had cleared, and the sun was shining with a brilliance that felt brand new. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with air that didn't taste like fear anymore. Behind her, inside the stone fortress, the shouting began. She could hear Matthew's voice rising in panic as the reality of handcuffs set in. "This is a mistake. Do you know who I am?" "I'm Matthew Sterling." Hannah didn't look back. She walked down the steps, hailed a yellow cab, and climbed in. "Where to, lady?" the driver asked. Hannah smiled, leaning her head back against the seat. She pulled out her phone and dialed her daughter's number. "Home," she said. "Take me home." As the taxi merged into traffic, leaving the courthouse behind, Hannah Jenkins realized that the diamond in the dust hadn't been the one on Tiffany's finger. It was her. And now, finally, she was free to shine. Matthew Sterling thought the world was a theater where he directed every scene. He believed that wealth was a shield against consequences and that silence could be bought. But he forgot the oldest rule of the universe. The truth has a way of surfacing often when you least expect it. This story isn't just about a divorce or a court case. It's a reminder that character is what you do when you think no one is watching. Matthew revealed his true self at 30,000 feet, believing he was untouchable. He didn't realize that justice doesn't always wear a robe. Sometimes it wears a tweed suit and sits in seat 2A. In the end, Hannah didn't win because she had a better lawyer. She won because she had the truth, and for once the right person was listening. Arrogance may build empires, but humility is what keeps them standing. Wow. Talk about instant karma at 30,000 feet. What would you have done if you were Judge Hawthorne on that plane? Would you have revealed yourself earlier, or waited for the perfect moment in court? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of justice served cold, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story about liars getting exactly what they deserve. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that the truth always wins. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next story.